right, we have a lot to cover today, you all, so we will go ahead and get started. So, welcome to Talk Tuesday, everyone. My name is William Brito, and I will be your virtual host for today. So, Talk Tuesday is a virtual series of workshop conversations that provides a forum that amplifies the voices of marginalized and/or underrepresented communities around various topics centered around intersectionality and social justice. The series plans to serve as a catalyst to promote, celebrate, and increase cultural awareness at GSU, encourage cross cultural dialogue and engagement, and advance global cultural fluency and cultural competency. Each workshop topic is uniquely designed and expertly facilitated to create a safe environment for authentic conversation, varying viewpoints, and cultural exchange. Selected guest speakers help to shift personal paradigms and facilitate learning and understanding through their scholarship, service, and storytelling. The topics and speakers presented do not represent the views of the Multicultural Center and Georgia State University, but are intended to reflect contemporary social concerns. All are welcome to take part in these cultural conversations. On this Talk Tuesday, Our Shared History, Our Shared Future, celebrating the contributions of Caribbean Americans in recognition of National Caribbean Heritage Month, our panelists will discuss the influence and impact of Caribbean heritage and ancestry across the globe. Our panelists include Janet Cordoves, Director of Higher Education Partnerships with the Interfaith Youth Corps, Devin Barrington Ward, the Managing Director for the Black Futurists Group, Denise Byram, founder and CEO of Us Two Merchandise and Apparel, and George Greenidge, founder and director of Greatest Minds. So some context. So since 2006, the month of June has been designated by presidential proclamation as an observation to honor the rich culture and heritage of the Caribbean people. About 13 million, close to 4% of the total US population, have Caribbean ancestry. This month also serves as recognition of the contributions Caribbean Americans have made throughout the United States. The Caribbean islands is probably best known as a vacation area with beautiful beaches, music, and cuisine, but there is much more that the region has provided, such as U.S. founding father Alexander Hamilton, who was born in St. Kitts and Nevis, Jamaican-born Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey, and Haitian-born Jean-Baptiste Dusable, who is credited with the founding of Chicago. Some other notable Caribbean American history makers range from sociologist and historian Dr. W.B. Du Bois of Haitian and Bahamian descent, Bayesian American politician and educator Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman to run for president of the United States, Puerto Rican-born bibliophile Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, civil rights activist Stokely Carmichael, aka Kwame Ture from Trinidad and Tobago, Haitian American architect Rodney Leon, creator of the African Burial Ground and the Ark of Return at the United Nations, and artist Jean Michael Basquiat of Haitian and Puerto Rican descent. Our Shared History, Our Shared Future is appropriately the theme for this year's Caribbean Heritage Month to recognize the extraordinary contributions Caribbean people have made to the United States from its beginnings and over the centuries. So we get into our discussion questions. For the month of June, we honor National Caribbean American Heritage Month. And so to begin this discussion, let's start by each of you introducing yourself and sharing a little bit about your identity and how your Caribbean culture has shaped your lived experience. And so we will start with Janet.
Buenas tardes. Thanks for having me here. I'm so happy to participate in this panel and to highlight the Caribbean cultures, and in particular, mine is Cuban. And so, first generation immigrant family from Cuba. And You haven't read too much about Cuba or know too much about Cuba. There's lots of other cultures and language on the island, including Afro-Caribbean, including Chinese Cuban, and French Cuban, just to name a few. And I'm sure that'll come out in some of my remarks. As a part of my work, it has been a focal point to highlight outside of the Western fear, how individuals come to find meaning, ways of knowing, values, religion, and how those faiths are expressed, right? So My work is in spirituality and religion, in particular at the engagement of vastly different ideologies and how they connect with one another. And a lot of times when you do that work, you forget about culture and language and history. And so to be one of the few Caribbean scholars in that space is quite riveting, and just changing the diaspora, adding other names and scholars to the experience and to the work. And so it's a great privilege of mine. And again, thanks so much for having me here.
Thank you so much, Denise. We'll move to Denise, or Jen, thank you, Janet. We'll move to Denise, Devin, and then George.
Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon. I think it's noon now. In my background, Jamaican first generation as well.
Uh-oh, Denise, I think we're having a little bit of connectivity issues. All right, we'll wait for Denise to come back so she can get a proper introduction. We'll go ahead and move to Devin.
Can you all hear me? Awesome. So my name is
And
Devin Barrington Ward. I think Denise was trying to talk again.
It's okay. Go ahead and continue, Devin. I'll send her a message.
Okay. So my name is Devin Barrington Ward. I am a proud Caribbean American of Jamaican and Trinidadian descent. So when you shout out Stokely Carmichael, my dog got excited because he's named after Stokely Carmichael. Stokely, his name is Stokely Kwame Barrington Ward. And so, yes, I'm a proud Caribbean of coming from folks who have been freedom fighters, particularly in Jamaica. I think the last time I was with y'all, I showed a picture of my great great grandfather from 4 generations back, Paul Vogel, who's one of Jamaica's national heroes. He led a rebellion in Jamaica. I have a tattoo of it on my chest, but I won't show y'all that. But he led a rebellion in Jamaica called the Morat Bay Rebellions in 1865. This was shortly after Jamaica had ended slavery, but what I would call Jamaica had entered in its Jim Crow period, where there were lots of laws that limited the rights and freedoms of the Black people on the island. And my great grandfather he was free, and he actually owned property and was a spiritual Baptist minister, but saw the conditions of the people in his parish and realized that it wasn't sustainable for him or for his fellow countrymen. And so went to the courthouse, was refused an audience with the governor, came back to the courthouse with some folks. There was some words exchanged, and the courthouse was burned down, and 60 people were freed from the jail, and a rebellion had commenced. Lots of people lost their life, but also it was a turning point in Jamaica's history for the people of Jamaica to get greater self-determination and freedom. I'm honored that I'm a part of that lineage, and I get to call him my great grandfather, and he's a part of the ancestors that look after me. On the Trinidadian side, I have to uplift my latest ancestor, my grandmother, Jean Ward, who just passed away 2 months ago, but was the life of the party like every Trinidadian. Taught me the beauty of carnival. She taught me how to wind my waist and how to be Kitty Carnival King 2 years in a row. Yes, you're looking at him right here. It's a Kitty Carnival King, and play mass and eat roti and cook curry and all sorts of things. And so I'm blessed of being able to have those two experiences, and it has paid dividends in the work that I do now as a frontline racial justice action organizer and a candidate for public office. And so I'm honored to have that a part of my history and take all of those experiences into the spaces that I go in. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Devin. I always enjoy hearing that story about your great grandfather. So it's always like new news for me.
Okay.
I'd like to go back and revisit Denise. Sorry about those connectivity issues, Denise, but please introduce yourself
yes,
and a little bit more about who you are.
absolutely. Thank you. Sorry about that. Gotta love technology. But my name is Denise Byram. I'm owner and founder of Us Two Merchandise and Apparel. And it started as an apparel and t-shirt line celebrating music, history, and culture. My background is Jamaican American first generation, but then just highlighting, so many islands on apparel. I know we've all traveled, and a pet peeve of mine is, when you travel to the islands, you just get, for Jamaica, that green, yellow, and black t-shirt with the island on it. It says Jamaica or Yemen or, some of the trends or more popular sayings and things. So I just wanted to take it further than that and really just bring the cultures together in ways outside of just the generic flag colors and then the country across the t-shirt, but it's educating people as well. As if you all have gone to the website, it's shirts where people stop and they ask questions and they say, what is that? And, so it's really a way of my way of educating, teaching people in a different way about the West Indies. And again, the contributions and the culture of the beautiful islands. So yeah, that's about it for now.
Thank you so much, Denise. And lastly, we have George, also known as Chip.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. And Denise got the funkiest background. We got to give it the funkiest background. And that's why her connectivity issues right now. But got to give it up to her and all that. And I just want to thank you for inviting me and be a part of it with these panelists. I'm originally from Boston, and a couple of people from Boston said, "Hey, you're with a great group." Wendell Bishop, if anyone knows who that is, but he propped up this panel and was very excited. So glad to be here today. I run a group called Greatest Minds. It brings together people to talk about race, class, and justice, and also gender identity on campus and also in different cities. I'm also a PhD candidate here in sociology and race and urban studies. I went to Morehouse, went to Harvard. From Cambridge, Massachusetts, but I'm from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Very interesting because I got there because of my great and great grandparents who were told the streets were paved of gold. And they were at one point. There were tons of factories up in there right next to Harvard and MIT. But my great grandfather from St. Kitts, who was also a writer, he was actually one of the earliest writers right before the Harlem Renaissance, and was just highlighted in a book that just came out, African American writers and poets and so forth. So, I am so glad that Brother Devin, and I'd also like to hear Janet and also William, yourself, and Denise's stories about, how information of all this has been transpired to each of us, because it's interesting of me hearing about the kind of vocal and oral histories of our families and how we get it in bits and pieces and we don't get it all in one different swoop. And I decided with that is that I've been starting to write blogs during the pandemic, and I started my own website, and I just put it in there for you guys to know, but that was one of my projects to do. But one of my first blogs is about my family's history with racism in this country. I'm talking about them being from St. Kitts and Barbados, and them being, as they always tried to work hard and struggle and try to get food on the table, their bouts with racism in everyday life. And so, I heard about these stories, bits and pieces. And then I just said, during the pandemic, I just wrote them and put them all together. And that's one of my first blog pieces. But, it's still interesting. We talk about slave narratives. We're still in slave narratives today. The lives that we live in this society, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, all these young people and older people that have been abused by the system, police systems, and so forth. These are also, I try to tell people, are part of our narratives and our histories. It's our histories happening right now. So I want our young people to start embracing them. I want us to embrace them and start writing down these stories, because these are the process as we go for a total liberation of our communities and so forth. There's something called it's called the long movement, and it's in the Black studies. I'm talking about that the civil rights movement is not just one singular thing. It's a part of this longer history of what goes on in this country. When the first enslaved person got off and punched somebody in the face and said, "Get off me," in the 1500s and 1600s off the thing. That's when the civil rights movement started, and it's all connected to Black Lives Matter and all these things down now. So I close in my opening just to say thank you for being here. Love to be in this discussion about, as we push the discussions about immigration in this country and what that actually means. And you know, students here, I met a student that was looking for a GRA position, and she was from South America, and I was able to help connect her over the last 3 days to a GRA position. But these are the things that you know, our people from the diaspora do face daily. And I'm here to be glad to be a part of the discussion with GSU, glad to be a part of the discussion with Multicultural Center and all of you today. And I can't wait to learn from all of you guys. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, panelists. Those were wonderful introductions. I will be honest with you. We have a lot of questions to get through this particular Talk Tuesday. These are some really good questions and all of those things. So I do open the floor up. If you feel as if one panelist has already expressed a perspective that you were going to share to minimize on time, of course, we can always move forward because I would like to get through all the questions. Also, if we could kind of keep our answers at minimum to 60 seconds. If you go a little bit over, I mean, I can't do anything about that. But yes, if we can just be mindful of how long our responses are so we are able to get through all of the questions. So without
You
further...
can mute us, Will. Now stop. You can mute us. Now stop. Don't try to say you ain't got no power.
I didn't want to take it there, but all right. So we move to our first question. Many people think about the Caribbean and limit it to Haiti, the Bahamas, and Jamaica. While the latter islands are the largest countries by population, it may give a limited view of what it means to be Caribbean. What are common misconceptions about Caribbean heritage, and how can we combat them? So I'll actually throw this first question to Denise, and then anyone else, please feel free to chime in.
Yes, absolutely. Common, what was how did you phrase it? What are common misconceptions? Absolutely. So I'm originally from upstate New York. So if you're familiar, that's like, I'm from Rochester, but there's that Rochester, Buffalo, Syracuse, that region. Whereas downstate, you know, your New York City area is very familiar with the islands and a lot of people of Caribbean descent in that area. Upstate New York, if you hear an island accent, 95% of the time, everyone's going to assume you're from where? Jamaica. So I just think it's really based upon demographics, because also if you're in the South Florida area, you know, you're familiar with more Caribbean populations and things of that nature. So I think that's just, it's not their fault that they don't know, but if you're from a certain region that doesn't have a more diverse background of persons and people, you would not know. So I would say it's not their fault, you know, if you knew better. If they knew, you know, then they'll say, oh, okay, that's a different island, that's a different island, that's a different island. So yeah.
All right, other panelists, misconceptions of the Caribbean.
I think one of the misconceptions is that one, that only Black people live in the Caribbean, and we know that that's not true, particularly in Trinidad, which is oftentimes referred to as the New York of the Caribbean, because there's so many different racial groups there. You have Indians, you have people from the Middle East, you have Chinese Trinidadians, you have Black people. And so that is a misconception that the Caribbean is not a melting pot. And so there have been times where I know there's like a Royal Caribbean Bakery off of Memorial Drive is owned by Chinese Jamaicans. And so sometimes people will walk in there and see Chinese people speaking with a Jamaican accent, and their eyes go like this, like, oh gosh, you know, I didn't know that that was something that could happen. So that's one misconception. I think another misconception, because of the racial diversity, that racism doesn't exist in the Caribbean. It absolutely does. It is more nuanced. It's oftentimes disguised under colorism. And so there are problems. Many of the problems that exist here in the United States do show up in the Caribbean in lots of ways. And also the United States can oftentimes be a contributor to that, just the presence in the region and the way that Americans can come down with their very white supremacist beliefs, because that is how we have been taught and trained about history, and can inflict that on Caribbean countries due to the high amount of tourism. The other thing is that every Caribbean country is supported by tourism. Absolutely not. They have very robust economies. For example, Trinidad is an oil-based economy. It's part of the reason why you can get direct flights from Houston to Trinidad. And people oftentimes feel like that's weird, but it's because a lot of people do work in the oil industry and the energy industry down there. The last thing that I would say about a common misconception about the Caribbean is that homophobia there is more massive there than it is in other places. As a queer Caribbean person, it is nuanced. It is not all black and white, and I will end it there.
I was going to say, hold that thought, Devin, because we have you coming with that question later on.
Okay, great.
Janet or George, would y'all like to contribute to that particular question? All right. We shall move forward. All right, so my second question, or our second question rather, according to Representative Barbara Lee, Democrat from California, she stated that Caribbean Americans have influenced every aspect of American culture, society, and government. Their history is interwoven with ours. How important is it to recognize the contribution of Caribbean culture to the growth and success of American culture? And we'll start with George, and then we'll move to Janet and anyone else who would like to answer.
Definitely. I think as we look at the Dreamers and the DACA students and all those other things, it's important to realize that America is a land of immigrants, and we need to recognize that people came from somewhere and came here to start their roots and start their dreams of what America was supposed to be, of giving people opportunities and so forth. So, you know, I'm just really excited that we have the space to actually talk about the rich Caribbean culture, and also being in Atlanta, the home of the Black Mecca, as it's called. It's it's interesting to have this kind of context to talk about just where we're at as a people of color and Black communities, and how we embrace all those different things. And just a real quick side note, is very interesting. My dad went down to St. Kitts, and he's never been, and he got off the plane, and St. Kitts is a very small island, and people looked at his face and told him who his family was. So it was amazing. He said, "Chip, I've been thinking, Chip, I'm George Jr." But you know, his grandfather was named George Reginald Markinson, and I'm named after him. And he's but it's interesting. They looked at his face, and they told him exactly who his family was. So it's very interesting how small these islands are in community. But also, you got to also realize is that I did that little ancestry.com piece, and I realized that I have a lot of cousins and all these other things that were not written down. So, you know, it's just very interesting how records were kept. And, you know, that's just the way the 1800s and 1900s were, and when they started doing censuses and so forth. But there is lots of history between us. I have family that I've been able to go to Trinidad, Tobago. I have family that I went to Cuba. I have family, all these. So it's just very interesting how intertwined that we all are as people. That's all I have to say.
All right, Janet.
Thank you. I think it's extremely important to call out the Caribbean contributions. One, to combat the misconceptions that people have, or the single story of who we are and what we do contribute, right? And so, you know, in thinking about just, I mean, historically, absolutely, architects and engineers and freedom fighters, absolutely. But even like in current times, right? Like now, you know, we have Rosario Dawson, right? She main actress in Rent, right? She chose love over fear and to live without regret. Soledad O'Brien, and how she pursues the truth, right, and brings up stories from all of our backgrounds and highlights our contributions to the country and where the nuance is there. Mike Fernandez is an entrepreneur and billionaire that's raising millions of dollars in Florida to support undocumented students. And a favorite poet of mine, Richard Blanco, at Obama's inauguration, a Cuban gay poet who speaks about grappling these two tensions, right, of like that bicultural, tricultural, of like being from the island, growing up in the US, finding your identity. And so I think it's really important to call out who these Caribbean Americans are, or Caribbean contributions historically. But I'm just thinking now, as like we're talking with college students, we're everywhere. We're in entertainment, we're entrepreneurs, we're CEOs, we're engineers. And so I think it's really important to know who they are and to call out so that you have a sense of pride, right, and a sense of self-esteem. Because what I've noticed in my pursuit of education here in the US, those stories are only told to me from my parents or my family, like that intergenerational home. They're not in textbooks. It's not blatant, in advertising or marketing. And because we are from the whole diaspora of, being colonized by the French and the British and the Spaniards, we look like anyone. And so you don't really know. And so I think it's important to highlight them for ourselves and for our students and for one another. One, to know that it's not a single story, but two, just to show our pride for who we are and what capable, amazing, resilient people, beautiful people we are.
Thank you, Janet. Denise or Devin, would you all like to contribute to that particular question?
And just to quickly add, people like Colin Powell, his parents were Jamaican immigrants, and he was the United States Secretary of State. I don't think a lot of people know that Shaggy served in the U.S. Army. Like Shaggy is a veteran. So exactly. So many contributions, the unknown, like Janet mentioned,
Are
of
we talking
people.
about Caught Me Red-Handed
Shaggy.
Shaggy?
Yes, it wasn't
Oh,
me.
wow.
Shaggy is
Oh, wow.
a U.S. Army veteran, Jamaican born. Absolutely. So just the history, like you said, the contributions we've made far beyond, food and music and so many other things.
Absolutely. And I think that too sometimes, oh my gosh, I'm speaking, I don't normally contribute to the question as a facilitator. I always go to the third one, but I think that's very interesting that, you bring that point up because it kind of demonstrates how the intersectionality of culture kind of gets lost in American culture. And we don't realize that those different cultures, like Caribbean culture is American culture. We're a melting pot. And I think that sometimes the perspective is very much so us and them, or so thank you for sharing that. So we move on to our next question. So this Talk Tuesday holds double significance as it commemorates both Caribbean American Heritage Month and Juneteenth, a holiday which celebrates the last of American slaves finding out they were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. Share your perspective on being Caribbean descent and Black identity. How are these histories intertwined? And I'll let anybody start that one.
I'll start with that one. It's just a story. I remember in grade school, you always hear Black slaves picking cotton in the South. And I would remember one time my father, he goes, well, we didn't, just because you're Black don't mean you're from South, you're from the South. Like that's not all of our stories. So as a first generation American in the city school district in upstate New York, like I knew that at a young age, like just because my skin is brown does not mean my family ancestry starts in the South, the but below the Mason-Dixon line. So even that, they were in the fields, yes, but they were picking sugar, sugar maybe, but not necessarily cotton. So just hearing that small detail as a young child, I understood like you can't just lump everyone's beginnings and ancestry into this one pool because my skin is brown. We don't want to, it doesn't start there, but you still have to honor everyone's history, everyone's story, and what everyone has been through. And don't let the skin color, kind of erase that.
I having Jamaican parents who learned about their individual, fight, I guess, as Jamaican people against slavery and oppression. I'm grateful that my grandmother is still around on that side of the family because I would not have learned that history in America. And it's a shame because Jamaican freedom fighters and Haitian freedom fighters and so many of the others who fought back against slavery and oppression on the islands created kind of the model that was used on the mainland to also free Black Americans here. And so it's a shame that oftentimes that history is not taught, particularly around Haiti being the first set of Black people in the Western Hemisphere, followed by Jamaica, to liberate themselves. And that oftentimes is lost. That history is just as important as the history of rebellion leaders like Nat Turner and others. I wish there was some more connectivity around that. But I also think it's by design because if you teach oppressed people how their ancestors collectively liberated themselves, they will no longer be oppressed. And so it is imperative that those of us who represent the Black diaspora and the diaspora of oppressed people in this country and across this hemisphere really talk, frankly, with one another about the tactics and the strategies that we've used, and not use it as a way to wedge a divide, but as a way to, really liberate ourselves. And when we're liberated collectively as oppressed people, all people will be liberated. When I have this saying at the Black Futurists Group, we build Black futures because if there's a future for Black people, there's a future for all of us. And that is Black people in the United States, that is Black people in the Caribbean, that is Black people in Brazil, that is Black people on the continent. And so it's really imperative that we talk about those things and not see it as a divide, but really as a continuation of the story of freedom fighting, the continuation of the story of people liberating themselves and being liberated. And so that's how I look at the history of Juneteenth. And I also think it's June is a really important month because it's Caribbean American Heritage Month. It's Juneteenth. It's Pride Month. And so I love it because I get to be all of the things in June. Well, I'm all of the things 12 months out of the year, but in June it feels special.
Absolutely. There's a part two to this question, actually. So, as a Caribbean American, do you all identify first as your racial identity or your nationality or ethnicity? Is it possible to separate the two?
I'm gonna jump in again real
Okay.
quick and then I'm gonna be quiet. So I think that America forces you in some ways to identify as your racial group. That is the kind of the insidiousness of white supremacy, is that there is no nuance when I am seen by American culture. I'm just seen as Black. Not that I'm Black. It's so funny. People will say, and you even hear some Black people say, I want to live in a diverse community. Well, baby, if you live around Black people, you live in a diverse community. Black people are from all over. Black and brown people are from everywhere. And so it's unfortunate that America kind of forces you to identify as your racial group first. But in that force, there's still camaraderie and community that can be found in it. But I find myself that this country forces me to identify as one thing first, versus of giving me the nuance and the ability to identify as in the ways that I want to. That's the insidiousness of white supremacy.
Thank you, Devin. Janet and then George, if y'all like to contribute.
Yes, I mean, I find it quite difficult to separate, and um, growing up in Miami and then on the East Coast, I found spaces where I could be fully Cuban and really connect with my other Caribbean compadres. And so I was flushed and really proudful of my ethnicity and my culture and my language. And as much as the cues were to assimilate, not from my family, but from society, 12, 16 years of education, all of that was to assimilate. I stood out like a sore thumb because of the stories that I would elevate, or the way I would phrase my writing, because Spanish was my first language. And so, and then when I traveled to Cuba to see where my parents were born, where they met, where they grew, where my brother was born, I mean, all of it, I stood out as a sore thumb there too. And I was like, no, this is like the one place I've been craving. And so I've never been able to parse them out. I definitely choose Cuban because I love my culture and my language and my family, and what specifically what my parents were able to do. My dad, our patriarchs, were political prisoners, right? And we were exiled from the country. So these strong, vocal men and women, my mom, my aunt, who brought all their children in El Marelito, a very difficult, hard decision to make as a family to start a new life in a different country. And so there's a lot of pride in that. So I don't separate them, but I think even if I don't want to, the Cuban just comes out first.
Absolutely. George?
Um, it's interesting. Just and this is for me. I I claim African American, Black American, and with Caribbean roots, and I know that a majority my family came here for a reason and a purpose, and were able to succeed, knowing those nuances that was going to happen when they came over here to the United States, Boston and New York, and Ellis Island and so forth. So I claim that. But it's interesting. I know the stories from my grandmother and grandfather and all of them about of the heritage and so forth. But I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Um, so grew up, working middle class. Two parents worked, and all these other things. So those are also a part of my identity of seeing my parents work every day, um, seeing them, get up and go to work. And that was kind of the Caribbean thing. You just went to work, there's no such thing as, what do you mean being on unemployment? That's what you're talking about. You better have 4 jobs, which is so these are like, new words for the lexicon, especially right now as we face a huge health epidemic here in the country. It's just like you just worked and you worked hard and you came home and you provided for your family and your kids the best you knew how possible to do so. You owned a house. These are just some of the Caribbean pieces that we were just kind of passed down. And it's interesting in Boston. I think the Federal Reserve Bank did a study on Blacks and Caribbeans and whites in Boston, and they said that African Americans born and raised had an $8 net worth, where Caribbeans might have had, I think it was like maybe I can quote the numbers around, maybe like a $40,000 or $50,000 net worth, and compared to the white Bostonians who had like $180,000 net worth. So that goes to show you something about, especially in the Boston area, how the mindset of a Caribbean is, and also their interaction with the victim system of being in housing developments and all these other things, where someone coming here might take a different stance on. It's interesting. I talked to my friends from Nigeria, and they kind of say, my father was a businessman there. My uncle was my father was a politician, and all these people talk about all the jobs that they had and how important they were and so forth. And so it's interesting when you hear the students from the South or other people talk about their own experiences about entrepreneurship and their experiences with it compared to people from the islands and the experiences with it. So it's just a very good kind of discussion piece to see who's in front of you, and you can't be what you can't see and so forth.
And to piggyback off, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Denise.
Just to piggyback off of George, so Caribbeans are known as laborers oftentimes, their restaurants and their stores. But what the missing piece is, they're laborers, but in many times, please believe they own that building to that restaurant. They own the building to that shoe store. There's some rental units upstairs. So yes, they're laborers, but ownership is very, very important. So that's a missing piece I think the Americans miss, as far as the labor. They see the laboring side up front, but they don't know ownership is a huge part of who and what we are as well.
Absolutely. Thank you all. So we move on to our next question. In the wake of the tragic murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minnesota police, Chairman of the CARICOM Reparations Commission and Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Dr. Hilary Beckles, exclaimed, "The Minneapolis fight was Marcus Garvey's fight. It was Martin Luther King Jr.'s fight. It was Malcolm X's fight. It was Bob Marley's fight. It's a Caribbean fight, and it's a global fight." This statement connects the long-established, historically intertwined bonds and shared destinies of the people of the Caribbean and the United States. Do you believe there is solidarity with the fight for equality and justice in the United States? I'll start with Devin. We'll move to Denise and anyone else who'd like to contribute.
Yes, there's most certainly that level of solidarity because, again, while there are these nuances and oftentimes there is the experience that Black Caribbean folks have in the United States where they may be able to acquire more economically, and that's not always true in every city, but they are still impacted by systemic racism, particularly in the criminal legal system. My first girlfriend, who's still like family to me, her family is from St. Kitts and Nevis. And just yesterday, we were able to get out a cousin who was like a little cousin. We were able to get them out of the Fulton County Jail. And they've been sitting there for 3.5 years on pretrial detention. They weren't guilty of anything and just been accused. But because of the pandemic and a historically slow court system, here in Fulton County and a lot of places where there are lots of Black and brown people, that's where she sat. And seeing in Rice Street is one of the hardest jails. People oftentimes make comparison to that facility to a prison. And I was able to assist with getting her out because of some of my relationships politically in the area. But it was just another example of how we are impacted by the same BS that Black Americans and Afro Caribbean people and Latino people who are here in the United States, of a criminal legal system that sees us as the enemy, that sees us as the target, that sees us as human. So we are not extended all of the guarantees that we're supposed to receive under the Constitution and under the rule of law. And so it is an intertwined fight. It's the reason why Marcus Garvey didn't just do his organizing work in the Caribbean, where he was well respected, but went to the United States to build relationships with freedom fighters here and scholars here and thought leaders here around what does it look like to have a liberated movement that is across the Black diaspora. And so it is a movement that we are connected to, whether we want to or not, because there is some, we do have to acknowledge this. As someone who was born here, there are times where I've heard my parents and my grandparents say things about Black Americans that they had no context to say. That has offended me before because I'm like, well, I'm born here. And so I live in a Caribbean household, but when I walk out the door, I'm viewed as a Black American and I get all of the heat. I catch all of the drama, all of the oppression, all of the hatred that people whose roots originate from here in terms of slavery receive as well. And so we have to push back on that there is not this Caribbean exceptionalism and recognize that, the experiences and the rights that we have and some of the privileges that we have is because a Black person here in the United States died, got beat up, went to jail, lost land, was separated from their family so that we could have some of the freedoms that we enjoy today. And that comes with showing deference. And it also comes with being clear about how we are connected and contribute to the movement for freedom.
Thank you. And I believe next I said Denise or anyone else want to contribute. If not, that's fine. We can move to the next question. All right, let's move on to the next question. So in the article On the Midnight Train to Georgia, Afro-Caribbeans and the New Migration to Atlanta, It stated, "For years, African Americans have flocked to cities like Atlanta in search of economic and social opportunities. Now it's becoming a mecca for immigrants from all over the African diaspora. For immigrants, is Atlanta the shining city on the hill, or is it just another big American city with too many dreams and not enough opportunities?" I think, Devin, you're muted. Are you saying something?
That's a question. Wow.
Yeah, wow. That's what I was saying. That is a question. George, do you want to go first or anybody else?
I think together, because I know I don't have that much Atlanta specific context, and so what I do know from my work in particular is that diversity is neither good or bad. It's how is the engagement. And are we still in our homogenous communities as we're building out the city of Atlanta, or is the mosque across the street from the synagogue? And when there's a death, we support one another and show up, right? And so I'm not sure about that. I do know when the shooting occurred at two Asian American um, spas, right? That the African American population, at least what I saw on Fox and CNN, showed up, right, for the Asian American population that is in Atlanta, and I thought that was beautiful. And when I look at the Black Lives Matter protests from the summer, I saw Asians and Jews and whites, right? And so I think that's beautiful. But I'm not sure. I'm not on the ground, and we know we only get snippets of media coverage depending, and so I don't have a full understanding of the complexities of the city.
Thank you, Janet.
So
All
I will
right.
take this one. I grew up in Atlanta, and can y'all hear me? Is there a delay? Okay. So I grew up in Atlanta, and um, my parents were the folks that came down from Brooklyn and New York in like the early 90s. There's so many migrations to Atlanta, right? And that's, I think, why Atlanta is one of the most important cities in the world, and particularly one of the most important cities for Black people. And so I grew up on the east side, which was our equivalent of Little Flatbush. So if you want the best Caribbean food in Atlanta, you go to Decatur or you go to Stone Mountain because that's where we live. But of course, that's where Black people also live in the area. So we live around Caribbean folks, we live around other Black people, we live around other brown people. So we have our own pockets and stores and places and restaurants that we go to, but we are also immersed in the Black experience as well. And so I do think that it is a city that provides a lot more opportunity, particularly for folks who are coming from the Caribbean nowadays, because at the time it used to be you would only go to Brooklyn and you would go to South Florida. But now people are seeing, because those areas have become so much more expensive and Atlanta is still relatively affordable in comparison to those places. So a lot of newer immigrants from the Caribbean are starting to come to Atlanta and not migrating to New York and South Florida and then making their way to Atlanta. Some are coming directly to Atlanta. And so I think that that is indicative of the fact that Atlanta is a city of opportunity, and is a city, that is, I believe, on a hill because it is Dr. King's city. And so we are constantly chasing the moniker that we are a city too busy to hate. And I see that every time communities show up for one another, like the Asian community after the spa shooting, like many of the protests over the summer for George Floyd and our Atlanta's own Rayshard Brooks, and so many others. But there's also some challenges because we are still the city that's in the middle of Atlanta. And so one of the quiet kept secrets is that many of the folks who are arrested here on immigration violations are not actually folks from Mexico and South America or Central America. They're from the Caribbean. They're from Africa. They're Jamaicans. They're Haitians. They're Trinidadians. They're people from the continent. And that's oftentimes a narrative that's lost in the system of a broken system of immigration that preys not just on brown people, but on Black people as well. And some of the horrors, we talk about the detention facility down in South Georgia that was doing involuntary hysterectomies on women of the immigrant experience. And many of them were Black women from places that weren't English speaking countries. And so there's still work to be done because we are still under the leadership of a white supremacist governor and a white supremacist state leadership that, is constantly challenging all of the gains that Atlanta tries to make. So we're in a battle for who we are, but I believe Atlanta is on the winning side.
Thank you, you all. All right, so I will move on to the next question. All right, so people from the Caribbean are some of the earliest voluntary migrants to the United States and the largest source of its Black immigrants. Can you talk about the Caribbean migrant experience and thoughts on U.S. immigration policy? So we'll start with Janet, Denise, and then anyone else who would like to answer.
I'm still getting my thoughts together on that.
No problem. Denise,
Yeah.
would you like to chime in?
Yes, definitely. I'll talk about a little bit about the migrant experience for upstate New York, which I'm familiar with. So in Rochester, there's like there, and we talked about earlier, like the social class. There was definitely a social class of immigrants in upstate New York. Either they went to the mine to work on as a migrant worker. So there was a lot of apples upstate, right? So they were picking apples, they were on the farms. And then there's Kodak. Kodak, as you know, was a big industrial business. So a lot of our immigrants, they either were on the fields or they were in the factories. You know what I mean? So you were making a minimum wage amount or you were making a salary amount, let's say the 70s and early 80s, your outcomes were a little bit different. Where you are currently were a little bit different. And the communities still to this day see that, some people were able to put their kids to private schools and, have the bigger houses and things of that nature. And then the workers are the laborers. So you still see that. You talked a little bit earlier about some of what was the word you used? The differences between like social class and status, even in America. And I think that migrant experience of where you came and where you started working has a lot to do with that experience that you may have kind of dealt with.
Absolutely. Thank you, Denise.
Thank
Janet,
you,
was that enough
Denise.
time?
Yeah, that was perfect. I
Okay.
had so many ideas and what stories to share. I really appreciated the extra minute. Um, I would say, when we immigrated to the country, we landed in Florida and shortly after um, moved to New York City. And in that respect, working quite quickly in bars, in gambling locations, in restaurants, to pick up the language and to pick up a skill set. My mom was an accountant in Cuba. My dad was an engineer, and so anything to put food on the table in a growing family. After a few years in New York City, we moved to New Jersey, and we were one of maybe five Cuban families, and we all knew each other in a mix of other like Caribbean cultures, Black, African, Mexican, Peruvian, El Salvadorian cultures, and I spent a great deal of time fighting two worlds of, my parents working really hard to send me to private school, um, and then taking a bus an hour away to an affluent private school, right, and then coming back to my city and my home and not being too naive, at least my older brother would call me, to play with the kids in my backyard, or not city smart, right, just book smart. And so yeah, so when my parents came, they really didn't have a lot of help. They were exiled from the country, and the reputation that preceded them is that they were political prisoners amongst the murderers and rapists and drug dealers, and you couldn't tell the difference from the American perspective. And so everyone that got off in Marielito was was not a productive citizen, right? And not to be engaged with. So to find work was quite difficult. You know, it was off the books. It wasn't glamorous or anything like that. But saving their pennies and making other connections at their church, you know, who did take them in, that did provide, that provided English courses. Was able to change those things around, but it was quite difficult.
Thank you for sharing. Anyone else? All right. Moving on. So, Vice President Kamala Harris is the daughter of Jamaican and Indian immigrants. Some would say her Jamaican heritage was a huge part of the Biden Harris campaign's outreach to Afro Caribbean voters. What does her election mean to Caribbean Americans as it pertains to representation in the White House? And do you think this administration will advance efforts to acknowledge the contributions of Caribbean Americans and the support of the Caribbean community? So,
I
go
yeah,
ahead, George.
proud of Vice President Kamala Harris. I haven't seen her in 3 months, but I'm very proud of her. I don't know if this is the strategy they're doing, is just do the work and stay low, but you know, that's just where I'm at on this. But I'm very proud of her accomplishment of being the first woman and first person of color and also someone with Caribbean roots to do so. But I haven't seen her though. That's my comment.
Okay.
You know, she's a Black woman. She is a Caribbean woman. And so, of course, they have her doing the hard work. She's been down in South America telling migrants not to come, which I imagine anyone with, you know, a shred of humanity and decency would, if that is what is being asked of you, would be a very hard task to do, especially considering that her parents are immigrants. And so, in some ways, while I'm proud, it also is indicative of how we treat Black women in this country. In order to climb the ladder, you have to do some of the hardest things in the White House. And, you know, Joe Biden isn't going down to Central America to tell them not to come. People who have nothing, who are trying to survive. And so, in some ways, it does make me a bit disappointed that some of the pieces that she's had to work on has been some of the ugliest business of the administration. But with that being said, I think beyond recognizing the contributions of Caribbean people, the best way to recognize those contributions is to be a good neighbor and to have foreign policy and immigration policy that is grounded in humanity, that's grounded in an understanding that these folks also and their ancestors also have contributed to the wealth of this land. And to make sure that we're engaging in commerce and economic and trading policy that doesn't take Caribbean countries and Central American countries and South American countries for granted and for ransom, but actually views those countries as equitable trading partners and as countries that aren't just in America's backyard, but are countries with their own sovereignty, their own culture, their own history and contributions and brilliance that they provide to the world stage. I don't want any more. We already got June as Caribbean American Heritage Month. That's great. But I want policy that is substantive, particularly as it pertains to immigration.
Thank you, Devin. Would either Janet or Denise like to contribute to this question? All right. Y'all are fast today, moving forward. So, comprised of 26 countries with many different ethnicities, the Caribbean is easily considered a melting pot. How important is it to recognize intersectionality within the Caribbean community? And we will start with Denise.
Oops, sorry. Um,
That's okay.
I think it's very important. What is it? Race, class, gender, how they apply to each group particularly. As Janet mentioned earlier, maybe it was Devin, like Chinese Jamaicans is a very, very, huge thing. Not even a thing. It's just that country is compromised. What it is. Thank you. So if you see a Chinese person of Chinese descent, and they're opening their mouth and they're speaking patois, and you're taken back, that's very normal. Or even white people. There are white people in Jamaica, that speak the language. So just recognizing it, what they consider themselves, they'll say, I'm Jamaican. So it's to that question, am I a Black woman first, or am I a Jamaican American, woman first? So I think it's the individual and what you're comfortable with as far as the race goes, class and gender. As Devin mentioned about LGBT communities, there's an area in Kingston, Jamaica called New Kingston, and it's not what it once was. Like, the world is changing. There's still people who have their biases, and that's anywhere. That's in Jamaica, that's in America, that's in New York, that's in Africa, that's all over the world. But I think the reputation that Jamaica specifically has gotten over the years. Have you gone there? Have you been there? Do you see how these people are, living and moving differently than maybe 10, 20 years ago? So it really is a lot to take in. It's intersectionality in the Caribbean is huge. It's so huge. I don't think it can be one dimensional by any means, but you just have to have that experience for yourself. Many, many islands, many different cultures, many different languages. So you really have to take those trips. You have to and see it for yourself and live it.
Got you. Thank you, Denise.
I,
Yeah, go ahead, Janet.
Thanks, Denise. I'm just having some thoughts as you're talking, and I completely agree. I think it's so important to recognize and have people tell their story of their own intersectionality. I remember when I started facilitating just in my area with religion and worldview and things like that, very easily I would talk about like being Cuban, but having Afro-Caribbean and having Taino um, ancestry and cultural ways that we express our faith. I haven't done the lineage, I don't have the history, but it's in my home. And it's how we eat, from the mangu to some of our lexicon to our dances and to some of our holidays, right? But this melting pot, I heard it early on too, right? And I just want to be clear. I think it's so important to find common ground, right? Like we're lifting up these intersectionalities. I talked about Chinese Jamaicans, Chinese Cubans, right? And we go forth, or our resiliency, or our fight for justice, right? And how powerful we can be as a culture, as a Caribbean culture. But I really love our distinctness, right? Like our uniqueness, our own individual stories. And so just thinking that, I don't know, expanding on the melting pot, that we don't melt into one another, but that we have our uniqueness, but we have common ground.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in real quick. It's just really interesting just looking at my St. Kitts background, is that my great grandfather was named John Margetson, and he owned sugar plantations, and he was from London, and he was a white male, and he liked the ladies, as they said down there from oral history, and he had I think like 13 or 14 kids, and they were all biracial kids, or mulatto, or these are the words that were used at the time. And they were very educated down there. And his son, George Reginald Marketson, was very educated down there, went to the best schools. Sugar plantation was they made tons of money. And he was a writer, came to the States and wrote and worked. He mentored Dorothy West in Boston. And they also had a Saturday night quill, which was in Harvard Square, where all the Black writers got together. And if you Google Saturday evening quill, you'll see their writings of the 1900s, of the early writers coming together, making their own newsletters and so forth. But it's just really interesting if you look at the colonization history, and just if you look up the last name Margaretson, I am royalty. That's from Britain. Sir John Margaretson is a cousin of mine. So I would love to go, as my family says, we're going to go and do Guess Who's Coming to Dinner at the big family royalty reunion over there, because it'll be a really good party. But it's just really interesting as we look at those the long histories of colonization and all those other things, and how it's connected to many different things. And there are some people, as we know, in the areas of race, who have like to claim if they're white, they like to say they're black, or some of them that who are Latino that are white like to claim that. And it's just interesting the pushback regarding that about ethnic voices and who gets to claim them, and how people have been able to try to co-opt them to have a stance or a history in some kind of discussion. So that's a whole nother thing about the voice of the ethnicity and who gets to speak for it, and who's the proper representation of that, and how people try to co-opt the immigrant and the person of color experience, especially in these days. I know growing, I've heard about my family in London, where they were very, very light-skinned, where they were often were able to pass. And when one was actually outed in the late 1800s, they kicked her out a house, and her child, because of they found out she was black. No Negroes here, or that was the word. And so it's a painful past. Reading these stories from other family members that I met online, from London over the last couple of years. And it's just very interesting as we move forward. How do we collectively understand the voice of our Caribbean heritage, but also how that transcends all over the world?
Thank you, George. All right, our final three questions, or four rather. So Janet, this question is for you. You currently work with the Interfaith Youth Corps. Speak to the role faith has played in your life, and how does it connect to your Caribbean culture?
Thank you. Faith has been instrumental to my upbringing, and then eventually, my doctorate in the spiritual experiences of first-generation college students, and on the research team for the largest longitudinal survey, Interfaith Diversity Experience Attitudes Longitudinal Survey, that followed over 22,000 college students and their way of making meaning and their connection to their worldview. So it centers around my mother and reading the Bible daily. And although there are cultural influences, such as on New Year's Eve we would all bathe in the ocean for healing, right? And we would have certain dances as like coming of age. Our belief in Jesus wasn't separate from our culture, which I think happens quite often in the US, where they are distinct, and we limit God, I believe, in doing that. And so growing up Catholic, then with the influences of being Cuban and Native, and cultural influences of Santeria, as we had, we always focused on Jesus. And I think the pillar of being of hospitality and of being in connection with one another that comes from my faith is what's allowed me to be such a great writer and researcher. So it's definitely at the center of it.
Thank you so much, Janet. Devin, considering it is Pride Month, can you speak to the experience of being queer and Caribbean?
It is a beautiful experience. Because I am queer and Trinidadian and Jamaican, nobody can out-party me. And because I like to get on real bad, I like to get on real bad. So it's a beautiful thing, but it's a thing that we need to talk about in some more nuanced perspectives, because I believe that the Caribbean, similar to Africa, gets a unfair rap around how homophobia and transphobia shows up there, as if it doesn't show up in any other parts of the world, particularly here in the United States. Because one thing I will say is that how it is a political issue here in the United States is very different from how it is an issue in the Caribbean, because it kind of remains a religious issue that does influence politics somewhat. But I mean, people literally win office here on running on a homophobia platform. And you don't necessarily see that in other areas of the world. There are whole organizations here in the United States that are dedicated to the oppression of LGBTQ people. And again, those are not things that you necessarily see in other parts of the world. What we do see, though, is the white evangelical Christian movement that has oftentimes influenced the government policies in Africa and in the Caribbean, and many of them built churches in the Caribbean that have these very warped doctrines around queerness and Christianity and faith. I think the other thing that's important to note is that many of the islands in the Caribbean were known as slave breaking islands, where they would take slaves, Africans that they felt were too strong, too independent, too dominant, and they would take them to the Caribbean, particularly Jamaica and Haiti, and they would, break them essentially like how you would break a horse, because they didn't view us as human. And so part of the breaking of particularly a male slave was through sodomy and rape. And many of that unaddressed trauma and history from that influences a lot of the homophobia that you hear in Caribbean music, or see in Caribbean culture, or you'll see a video of someone being beat up, as if those videos don't exist here in the streets of Atlanta or exist in any other city here in America. The world has a homophobia and transphobia problem that's not isolated to one particular region. And we have to talk about how we have allowed white supremacy to hijack faith and religion, and condemn anything that is not seen as white, male, and straight. And so the Caribbean is a victim to that, just like so many communities across the world is a victim to that. But I think it's amazing opportunity to use June as a month to talk about both of those things.
Thank you, Devin. All right, our second to last question, because I want to honor you all's time. All right, so June is also coined Black Music Month. Major U.S. pop culture figures of Caribbean descent include hip hop founder DJ Kool Herc from Jamaica, Rihanna from Barbados, Nicki Minaj from Trinidad and Tobago, hip hop artist Biggie Smalls, also from Jamaica, excuse me, Tito Puente, Puerto Rican, Gloria Esteban of Cuban heritage. So Denise, your business is named Us Too. Can you share what inspired the name and the mission of this?
Yeah, absolutely. As a first generation, I'm a mother, I have a daughter. It's just keeping the culture alive, you know what I mean? Through the music, through the food, but also the rich history, as she gets older, teaching her who Paul Vogel was, who Marcus Garvey was, who Nanny of the Maroons was. So Us Too is just incorporating. Yes, she knows Barris Hammond and Bob Marley and oxtails and jerk chicken, but it's more than that. So that's our responsibility as first generation Americans, to teach our kids and keep that history strong and rich as the lineage continues, most likely here in America. So not losing that, still Black in America, absolutely, but then respecting the ancestors, their fight, their flight, and their struggles to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Denise. So last question for our panelists. International icon Bob Marley coined the phrase "One Love," which has become synonymous with Jamaica and the Caribbean. What two words would you describe for your love for your Caribbean culture? So we'll start with Janet, we'll move to Devin, Denise, and we'll close out with George.
I can add a little bit of narrative. We have a few minutes. Yeah. I think of my culture brings me such joy and pride, and being from the Caribbean gives me so much power and strength. And so the two words that I chose were joyful power.
You know, one of the phrases in Trinidad, they say God is a Trini. And I believe that because we're one of the islands that don't always get hit by hurricanes, where we're situated at like we're the last Caribbean country before you get out to sea, before you go to Africa. And I think that I see God in Caribbean people. I see God in all people, but I see God in Caribbean people because, you know, who else can survive slavery, can survive oppression, apartheid, global warming, all of the things. We are so resilient. So I think about God and resiliency when I think about Caribbean people.
Thank you. Denise and then George.
Jamaica's motto is out of many, one. So the rich diversity and history, of course. I know Americans may hear one Caribbean accent and think everybody's Jamaican, but no, we know the difference. So just the diversity. So I would say that, and then like Devin said, the resiliency. Like, you're not going to stop us. You put us in any situation, we're going to find a way.
And lastly, George, close us out.
Yes, I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with my neighbors being Puerto Rican, Dominican, Haitian, I throw a little Portuguese in there, Cape Verdean, Barbadian, and you know, I just remember these, just growing up, you know, just hearing Erie, and also hearing Yankee boy, and all those things, and those are compliments of hi, and also Yankee boy meaning, you know, yes, you are from here, but you know, you got a little bit of America in you. So I really appreciate that, but also just the hard work of Caribbean people just in life. So when I hear that word, you know, you're just a Yankee boy, that means that they recognize that who you are and what you bring, but also know that, you know, you do have American styles. So thanks.
All right. Well, I want to say thank you all to our wonderful panelists today. This has been an amazing conversation.
Can we get a
Myself,
picture? Can you get us a picture or someone take a picture?
I don't know how to do that, but I will send you the video. So what I want to say thank you all. This has been very enlightening for me as a Black American who does not identify with Caribbean heritage. This was very eye-opening for me, and shed a light on a lot of my ignorance and a lot of my lack of knowledge on certain things. So I'm always down for learning. I love learning. So thank you all so much for today's conversation. Uh, so yes, without further ado, you all, we hope that you have enjoyed our first Talk Tuesday of the summer. There will be another one coming up next month where we will be discussing the Olympics and its impact on Atlanta culture and those things. And so we look forward to seeing you all. But without further ado, once again, we thank our panelists and you all enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you so much.